maybe if you, I could share a few opening words before we get started with our program. First of all, we'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of Demetrius and Hiroki as well. I'd like to welcome everyone to the satellite. We have a very strong program this year, and also a very crowded program this year. So what we would like to do is give each of our presenters half an hour for their presentation, including questions and answers. So please moderate your time accordingly. I'd also like to mention that of the presentations that are being held at this symposium, there's a publication opportunity in the International Journal for Complexity in Education that's edited by myself and Demetrius Stamvlasis, and we're currently working on the proceedings from last year, and it's going very well. They should come out shortly. And there will be another opportunity based on the current satellite in one of the issues next year. Is there anything else, Demetrius, Hiroki, that we need to go through?
Yeah. No, thank you, Matt. I would like to welcome everybody, and thank you for setting and organizing very well this satellite again. I have a question here. I have a message that this meeting is being recorded.
Well, so that's one thing I want to show. So because of the geographical distribution of all the people, not all of us can actually watch the entire session. So I will, record your talks if you give us the permission, so that at the beginning of each talk, please say, Hiroki, you can record or not, and then depending on your preference, we will record or we will not record your talks. And those recorded sessions will be posted to the shared drive, possibly Google Drive, maybe, so that even if you are asleep, you can watch others' talks tomorrow. Right. That's the plan.
Okay.
And welcome everyone. Thank you.
So the first speaker on our program is Vahid Aryadust. Welcome back to our satellite, Vahid.
Thank you very much.
I presume that you've given permission to be recorded.
I don't know.
I'm fine with that. Azrifa, are you okay with that too?
Yep, I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're okay with that.
All right,
thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you very much for inviting us. I'm delighted to be here. So last year we were in Singapore presenting on the complexity of language and citations, and this year I'm still in Singapore and I'm presenting on a similar topic. So we're going to discuss dynamicity of measurement and validity research in language assessment and second language acquisition, which is acronym SLA. This is a published paper which Azrifa and some colleagues and myself have published it in the Frontiers in Psychology. So we're going to touch on some of the more outstanding findings of the study. If you have questions, we'll be happy to answer your questions. I will start first, and then I will pass the floor to Azrifa. So our study is a review, a kind of extensive review, co-citation review of the fields that I mentioned before. There have been quite a few review papers in the past that have attempted to summarize the field of language assessment and also propose new directions to the field. These reviews are by nature primarily narrative reviews, and they include, for example, Bachman's review, Davis, and the rest of the papers that you see that we have cited there. So they can be characterized based on the provision of experts' intuitive, experiential, and explicit perspectives in focused topics. For example, Bachman's paper, which was published in the year 2000, aimed to provide a summary of the research trends in the field of language assessment. In one part of the paper, what he did was to cluster a group of papers into several groups, and then he argued that each cluster is going to flourish in this way and that way, probably is going to flourish in this way and that way in the future. If you look at the nature of the clusters, you will see that every cluster consists of just a few papers, which of course is based on the expertise of Lyle Bachman, who is one of the most influential authors in the field of language assessment. However, the usual limitation that's articulated by people in the field of scientometrics when it comes to narrative reviews is that such kind of clustering or narrative reviews do not have generalizability, because they're based on a very small number of papers which have been collected and which have been reviewed by experts. For example, if you compare one review in the field of language assessment with another review, you do find commonalities and similarities between them, but you also find a significant number of differences, which just indicates that the experts do not necessarily agree upon one idea because of their backgrounds and experiences, and also explicit perspectives in the focus topics that they take. So we were going to address this limitation, primarily the limitation in scope and focus of review, by using a technique which is called document co-citation analysis. And as a result, the present study has two aims. The first aim is to identify the intellectual structure of language assessment approach, which has been published in English peer-reviewed journals. So I would like to here put it up front that we have a limitation here, and that's we're only focusing on English peer-reviewed journals and not books. Then the second aim is, and of course we're not also including non-English papers as well. The second aim of the paper is, after identifying the intellectual structure of language assessment, what we want to do is to examine the assessment, examine the content of each of those clusters. This schematic representation of clusters at the bottom corner of the slide actually is a representation of what we want to do. So we cluster those papers based on the co-citation patterns first, and then we dig into each cluster to identify the contents and find out what differentiates one cluster from another cluster. This is not specifically a scientometric approach, because in scientometrics you're only dealing with the act of clustering. So we have actually adapted this approach from our own field, language assessment, and of course second language acquisition, because it's important for us to find out what characterizes the content of those clusters. We're going to use two frameworks. We have already combined them, and as a result of this integration and combination, we have created one framework. The two frameworks which we combined and integrated are validity arguments and measurement frameworks. We used two data sets. We downloaded them from Scopus. We compared Scopus from the with the Web of Science, and we found that it has a wider coverage, and therefore we decided to use Scopus. The papers that were published and indexed in Scopus range from those that were published in 1918 all the way to 2019. So there are two groups of journals here. The first group of journal, which consists of 4 journals, are language testing, assessing writing, language assessment quarterly, and language testing in Asia. And they include 1,561 articles from these 4 major journals. Basically anything that has been indexed in Scopus and published in these 4 journals. The second group of data journals, which we have referred to as general journals in applied linguistics, consist of 3,175 articles, which focus on language assessment. And they have been published in the top 20 journals that are ranked in the first quartile of SciMago, which I think has a connection with Scopus, or which is a part of Scopus. So another limitation of the study will be that we only focus on the top 20 journals in the field of applied linguistics. It would be interesting to find out what happens if we include more journals in our search. Okay, so here is a partial a representation of the journals that we have used, actually about 20 of them. As you see on top on the left side of the table, we have language testing, which comprises of 690 papers. And on the right hand side, and at the bottom, we have got English for specific purposes journals, which consist of 64 papers that are specifically about language assessment, testing of language abilities, or measurement of language abilities, or evaluation, or any of those keywords. Okay, so methodology. As I said, the paper has got two aims. Aim one was to investigate the intellectual structure in the field of language assessment. In order to address this aim, we used scientometrics co-citation and document co-citation analysis. There are different types of co-citation analysis: document co-citation analysis, journal co-citation analysis, author co-citation analysis, etc. We just use this DCA because this is the most powerful one, at least within the context of CiteSpace, which is the software that we use. The co-citation is the frequency with which two or more publications are referenced in another publication. When a group of publications cites the same paper and books, this means that they are not only thematically related, but they also take references from the same pool of papers. We should also add that if two papers are cited in one paper in a third paper, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are thematically related. So the more co-cited they are in different papers, the more thematically related. And the second aim is therefore to examine the content of the research clusters that will emerge from the examination of the first aim. And in order to do that, we're going to use a framework which I already mentioned, and I'm going to show that framework in a second. Here is a schematic representation of what we mean by co-citation analysis. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that on top we have a citing document which has been represented by capital A, and at the bottom we have two papers which have been co-cited. In a sense, we can say that A and B at the bottom are related because paper A on top is citing them. And of course, like I said, the more papers like A on top co-cite A and B together, the more evidence that A and B are somehow somewhat related to each other. But that could be quite speculative. And as a result, we have to go through the clusters, like I said, which emerge from this analysis to find out what really links them together. That's the answer to the second aim of this presentation. We have developed a framework, and this is a summary of the framework. We basically coded all the papers in the 6 major clusters, or 7 or 6 major clusters that emerged. And the coding scheme included these variables among other variables, but these are the most prominent variables that we coded for. So theory, construct, observation, observed score, universe score, target score, and decision. So I'm going to go through these and explain quite briefly to, at the interest of time, to just let you know what they are and what they mean. There's one more thing before I go on, is that between every 2 boxes here, as you see, there is a kind of annotation sticking out towards the left, towards the right side. For example, domain specification, construct, operationalization, evaluation, etc. These are called inferences. So in order to move from theory to construct, we need to draw an inference, which is called domain specification. Now, so I'm going to leave this discussion here, and if you have further questions about what we mean by inferences and all that, please feel free to ask during the question and answer, because like I said, I'm just concerned that we will run out of time. Okay, so the first inference that we coded the papers for was domain specification. The definition, here is how we define specification in brief. The definition of the target language use domain and the components of the representation of the construct in the question. Just to clarify what we mean by this quickly, well, basically all of us, I think, in this panel have taken a language test at some point in our life. The language test that we take is not just to see whether we can answer a bunch of questions or not. That's actually the very basic purpose of creating a language test and administering it to a group of test takers. The most important factor here to consider is whether the performance of test takers can be generalized to a domain, context, or an environment beyond the context of assessment. That context is called target language use domain. And therefore, if we are developing a language test, one of the first things that we have to define clearly is our TLU domain. In other words, to what context are we going to generalize the scores and the performances of test takers? The second thing is construct operationalization. After we define the theory or the theoretical framework of our test, then we have to translate the theory into a test. The process of translating is called construct operationalization. To put it simply, it basically means the process of developing of the test. Next is evaluation, which is basically eliciting the intended behavior from the test taker and using a scale to translate the performance to a score. In other words, the scale that we use, which is sometimes dichotomous, sometimes is polytomous, has to be reliable and valid for the purposes it has been developed. And then generalization, which is a very important concept, and it refers to establishing whether the observed scores represent a universe score and are not exclusive to the test form, to the raters, to the test item formats, etc. Given another example here to clarify, I take a test, imagine I take a test, and then my score is, let's say, 80 out of 100. Now, the question of generalizability is whether this 80 out of 100 will be consistent if I had been given another test which is measuring the same kind of construct. This idea of consistency and the idea of generalizability of my score to other forms of the test, to other raters who have scored my performance, is referred to as generalization. And finally, we've got explanation, extrapolation, and utilization. In brief, explanation is whether establishing whether the test engages the target construct or not. If I am, for example, developing a test of reading comprehension, do I have any evidence that the test is actually measuring the reading comprehension or is measuring something else, for example, mathematics and reading comprehension? Extrapolation is establishing whether the test scores can be extrapolated to or predict test scores performance in the TLU domain. And finally, utilization is how appropriately and meaningfully the test scores are used. Are they used wrongly for making crazy or stupid decisions, or are they used thoughtfully and thoroughly, and the users of the test scores are very well aware of the meaning of the test scores? That's referred to as utilization. Okay, so we are using SiteSpace, as I mentioned, and it has been developed by Professor Chao-Mei Chen. Actually, he was one of the authors of the main paper, which was published in Frontiers in Psychology. So the SiteSpace software is free, is wonderful, is great. You can create these wonderful pictures. For example, one of the visualizations that we created was in 2020, as you see on the right side. Of course, it's not created by SiteSpace, I should say, but it was primarily primarily emerged from the output that SiteSpace had mined for us in a large number of papers. Okay, now we're going to talk about the clusters and the two aims of the study. I'm going to pass the time to Azrifa. Over to you, Azrifa. I think I should stop sharing and
yeah, sure.
Right? Okay, I stopped sharing.
Screen. Let's see. Okay, so here we have the cluster map generated by SiteSpace for the core journals. Basically, if you look at the density of the nodes, you can see the little clusters that's formed. And then we have here the modality. Oh, sorry. Let's see if that is modularity Q, which is a measure of how well structured the network is. And basically, the higher the value, the better structured the network. We also have average silhouette score, which shows how consistent the cluster members are to each other, the homogeneity of the clusters. And both of these values range from -1 to 1. So we see here that the core journals have a fairly high Q value and silhouette score, which indicates a fairly well-structured network and a fairly homogeneous clusters. Sorry, I don't know how to do that without going next. Okay, does it still work, the share screen thing?
Yeah, it's working, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so we also have the cluster view of the general journals, and we can see here that we have a wider spread of topics and clusters, and just like the core journals, the Q value is relatively high as well, and we have the average silhouette value, which is about the same 0.7. So just as with the core journals, this is quite a good, well-structured network. So within these data sets, we could also determine which of the publications were actually the most influential. And as we can see, we have Buckman and Palmer featuring quite highly in this in the core journals. And the duration of bursts actually shows how long these have been cited. And we see that it's actually not just after the publication, date of publication of the books, but for quite a significant number of years after that. So the relative strength of the burst is here, and then we have the centrality, which is the degree to which the node connects to another node. So basically how this publication connects to the other nodes within the network. So a high value may indicate novelty, for example, a new idea introduced to the research area. And the sigma also, the higher values is also possibly indicative of novelty. It combines both the structural and temporal properties of a node, basically how long the duration is and the centrality. So one thing that we do notice is that books feature quite significantly in the most influential publications, and Buckman, for example, that we see here in the core journals are featured on both data sets, in both the core journals and the general journals, although not quite as highly in the general journals. And we also have Fulcher's Testing for Second Language Speaking and the CFR reference book. So as we can compare with the next table, the general journals actually show a more focused scope as compared to the general language assessments in the core journals. So we have Skehan's cognitive approach to language learning. We see Buckman and Palmer again. Then we also have Norris and Ortega's complexity, accuracy, and frequency framework introduced here. And we also have very specific Nation's classic book on vocabulary. Like the previous core journals data set, we have Buckman and Skehan also featured in the core journals, although again, not in the top 4. So in terms of the clusters, we have here the size of the cluster, which is basically the number of cited papers within each cluster. And we can see that cluster 0 is the largest here, as well as the number of cited papers, which actually shows how narrow or wide the scope is within the research area. The label LR here actually indicates the automated assignment of the labels, which is based on the log likelihood ratio. And as Wahid has previously mentioned, we also read the papers within the major clusters to determine how accurate actually these labels are. And so you can see here the comparison between the two, our labels and the automated labeling. Also, we have the mean side yields, which actually, well, it's kind of self-explanatory, but basically shows the peak of interest within each cluster. So these are the major clusters in the general journals. Likewise, we see a more narrow focus on certain topics like vocabulary and language acquisition, and it's more specific to acquisition as opposed to assessments in the core journals, because we see a lot of assessments here and rating and validation. So we also applied, to move on to our second research aim, we applied the analytical framework that Wahid has explained. This is an example of one of the data sets and how we have distributed, how it is distributed, and the number of papers that each cluster, each cluster reported reliability, generalization, etc., etc. So more interestingly, we can see from this graph, in terms of domain specification, two of the data sets shared the same central concerns here with listening, vocabulary, to a lesser extent, language proficiency, reading, essays, and oral production. So, and then this box indicates the specific concerns within the core data set, washback, corpus linguistics, and feedback that's not shared within the general journals data set, which has a wider scope in comparison to the others. So we have 15 constructs in the 6 clusters of the core journals and 26 constructs and domains specified in the 9 clusters. So the top 4 in the core journals were speaking, oral, communicative skills, writing or essays, reading, raters and or rating, while the top 5 constructs in the general journals were grammar, speaking, oral interactions, reading, and vocabulary. You can see from the peaks. What's interesting is that in every cluster of the core journals, we have speaking, oral, communicative, or oral communication skills, while grammar actually appears in every cluster of the general journals, except in cluster 8. So we can see that there are certain trends within even the 2 data sets. In terms of construct operationalization, we see that we found that basically production response format was more popular than the discrete point selected or selected response format, while across the 2 data sets is fairly equal in distribution. That's normed as well. So one of the major findings actually is that reliability is the most reported in the data sets, but even so, it was only reported in over half, so 56.7% of the publications reported reliability in core journals and 54.6% in the general journals. It's even worse for the rest, for generalization, criterion, explanation, and utilization. So this is an area that we might want to think about, and I think Wahid can continue on to the implications.
Can you just flash the last slide, please? Yeah, I'll just read it from, implication.
Okay.
Okay, the next one. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me just wrap up everything, everybody. As Rifas showed, a number of areas were underrepresented in second language acquisition and language assessment, and these include, to wrap them up, affective schemata, awareness, memory, language proficiency, language knowledge, language or semantic awareness, etc. So in both data sets, several textbooks, editorials, and review articles featured prominently and across the clusters. This is a very interesting finding because in other studies, we also found that textbooks tend to be quite influential in different fields, at least in the fields that we are familiar with. So one thing that textbooks have in common between them is that they often provide how to do things, like how to do recipes for creating tests, for validating assessments. And I think that's why a lot of people are interested to read textbooks and cite them. Now, the question that we are raising at the end of this project is, in addition to this speculation, what really makes a publication prominent? We looked into other available research on using scientometric methods, and we found out that some people have used regression methods to regress some kind of variables on the co-citation indices of influential papers. One of the interesting things that was found was, for example, the number of authors is an influential factor. Like if you have a large number of authors, there is a lower likelihood for that paper to become influential. The other thing that they found was the title of the paper. For those papers which have a clear and concise title, they have a higher chance to become influential over a certain period of time. There are quite a few other variables as well. We haven't investigated this, but it would be really cool to find out what variables would affect the degree of influence of papers in the field of language assessment and second language acquisition. And one last thing is there is strong evidence that the majority of citing papers in both core and general journals did not carry out inference-based validation that was spelled out by these guys. We speculate, we have two speculations for this. Number one is that really there is no need for inference-based validation, and that's the message that we can get from these papers. On the other hand, we might think that this is a serious limitation in the field of language assessment and SLA, and therefore editors of journals and reviewers of journals need to ask for inference-based validation evidence before they decide to publish a paper in which authors are claiming to have measured or assessed some kind of language construct. So, I mean, these are just two competing ideas. Future research can shed more light on this. And I think the last point, we have already talked about that. So this, maybe, Azrifa, can you go to the next slide? Okay, this is the paper which has been published, just in case any of you is interested to read more about the details. There's quite a little bit of details we didn't present, obviously, at the interest of time here. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Azrifa, do you have anything else to add?
No, thanks.
Okay, so, well, over to you, Matt, and anybody else who likes to ask questions. I think we have a few minutes left. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions for Vahid and Azrifa?
Yep.
I have a short question. Thank you for the presentation. Sure. You mentioned that the number of authors has no influence or something like this. I didn't get it. And why? The number of authors.
Yeah, that's actually, I was reporting the results of another paper, and I was speculating that that might also be a variable in our case. The paper mentions that the number of authors, if it's around 2 or 3, if I'm not wrong, it has a correlation with the degree of influence of that paper. Now that's just a correlation. It's not a cause-effect relationship. Exactly. The question is why. That's a $1 million question. I'm not really sure why, but I think who those authors are could be a factor. If those authors are well recognized or some so-called authorities in a field, that could count. I think that it depends on what data set we're looking at.
Yeah. And what software did you use for this, for the network analysis?
It's called CiteSpace. I can write it here in the chat box.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
CiteSpace. Okay, there you go.
Yep. I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Thank you very much for the great presentation. So I was wondering if you have seen in your data set, cases or that goes up and goes down and eventually come back later. So, like a comeback of the certain types of papers or clusters of papers. Have you seen that kind of the multimodal trajectory over time? Or is every cluster or paper, only has the one peak and then after that it's going to be, dead end?
That's a very good question. I try and answer, and Azrifa, you can also, share your thoughts on that. From what I recall, quite a number of papers are like that. Like they they're like sleeping beauties for some time, for a few years, and the duration is between 1 year to sometimes around 10 years, which it's like a flat line. Nobody recognizes them. Nobody knows that they have been published. And suddenly they start to pick the attention of authors, and they start to peak. And they, over a very short period of time, they reach what we call a burstness, because they suddenly burst, and then they start to go down after a period. Now, sometimes the period of burstness for some papers is about 1 year, sometimes it's 2 years, sometimes it's about 13 years. But yeah, that sort of fluctuation is always there, almost in all cases. Azrifa, you want to add anything?
I'll just share the previous one. So we see the duration of bursts here.
Oh, yeah.
That it can be quite long, actually. So we have 6 years. So as Vahid has mentioned, it was published in 1996, but you actually have a kind of like a peak there, which stopped at 2014. Of course, bearing in mind that we stopped our analysis on, I think it was.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Yeah.
Yeah. So
is it around 10 years? Or how many years is that? More than 10 years after the publication, it became a burst.
But in all of those cases, there's only one peak. So there's only one chance to be famous, right? I guess.
Yeah, there is one peak which lasts, in this case, between 2009 and 2014.
Yeah.
And then, yes, then it can die out after that.
Okay.
Oh, but it doesn't presuppose that they weren't mentioned before. I think it wasn't very clustered together, so to speak.
Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention and the questions. Thank you.